Okay, so I'd like to welcome now Brian Becker. Brian is head of the APL Tools Group at Dyalog. Has been for how many years? 3 years? 4 years?
2.5, 3, something like that.
Some time. Brian has been head of the APL Tools Group for some time.
It just seems like forever.
And he's going to talk to us about industrial strength web applications. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Okay, well, John's done the introduction, but let me say a little bit about the APL Tools Group. Basically, our job is to provide you with tools that make it easier for you to do your job. So as you identify things that you need us to build, let us know, and we'll put them on the list and hopefully get around to building them. But one of the things before we begin, if any of you were in Elsinore last year at the conference, yes? Okay, Dr. Jerry Brennan gave a talk, and at the beginning of his talk, he showed a number of pictures of his home and where he lives, which happens to be Oahu. So there were pictures of the beautiful grotto that's outside of his, just off of his property that he can swim in, and the Eden-like gardens near his lanai. And so in that spirit, I thought I would share in a few weeks, this will be my existence. So feel free to visit anytime you want. So what we're going to talk about today is what is MiServer and what are some of its features, and then talk about some of the new features that are going to be coming out with version 3 of MiServer. I always start out this conversation or these presentations with what is a web server. I hope probably all of you have seen this slide at least twice by now, but I will subject you to it once again. It's a program that listens for HTTP requests for resources from some sort of a client, and normally those clients are going to be some sort of web browser. The server then tries to locate the resource that was requested, and if it can find it, it'll return it back to the browser. And sometimes the resources that are requested, instead of being some sort of static data content, might be a dynamic script, in which case the server generates output and sends it back to the client. That's what MiServer does. So MiServer is more than just a web server, though. It is a web server, and it's written in APL by APLers for APLers. It's also an extensible web server framework. And by that, we mean that you can add your own features and extensions. And it's a web application server. Now, what does that mean? Well, basically, you can provide a web interface on top of or in conjunction with a new or existing APL application. And of course, if it's a web interface, then your client list is almost unlimited. Any platform with a web browser can then access your application. MiServer also includes an ever-growing suite of HTML generating tools. So it's not just the server, it's also the tools to help you build the HTML content for your website. It's cross-platform. It currently runs on Windows, Linux, AIX. It runs on the Raspberry Pi. And in the future, as Morton had indicated a little earlier today, it'll run under OS X on the Mac and Android and who knows where else. The other thing is it's open source. It's currently available on tools.dyalog.com, and we've put up a version on GitHub. And as soon as I learn how to navigate around GitHub a little more, we'll be refreshing it with the MiServer 3 content. I wanted to talk a little bit about MiServer's evolution. The wild server was developed by Stefano back in around 2007, and basically was an endeavor to make use of the object-oriented features of Dyalog APL. Well, it was very object-oriented, and so Morton took it and turned it into the mild server, which made it a little more palatable, or not palatable, but usable by mere mortals. And the first version came out in January of 2009. MiServer was something that when I began with the APL Tools Group, we brought out the first version of MiServer 2 years ago, and then version 3 will come out in second quarter next year. What's the philosophy behind MiServer? Well, we've got a tagline, and you've probably seen it on our demo websites. Anyone who can write an APL function should be able to host it on the web. And we want to provide a suite of HTML generating tools that cover most common use cases. We want to try and make it such that the average APLer doesn't need to learn a lot about JavaScript, a lot about CSS, a lot about HTML, but be able to do significant work and deliver decent user interfaces without going into those other technologies. So one of the stated goals coming out of this conference is that we want to make it no more complicated to generate rich user interfaces than using the Dyalog GUI function quad WC. But we also want to provide interfaces to the underlying power of some of these JavaScript libraries and such to people that want to make and are able to make use of that. So we would look at JavaScript, jQuery, jQuery UI, jQuery Mobile, Syncfusion. And we want to make the framework easy to extend and modify, which means that you can add APL extensions, and you can also incorporate other third-party, other JavaScript libraries easily into the MiServer framework. So where is MiServer in use? Can I have a show of hands of how many people are using or have used MiServer? Wow, it's a lot more than I thought. Great. And please, I'd love to hear from anyone that, especially who I don't know that well, about your experiences. But we use it for the monitor and administrative console for the Dyalog File Server. It's been running as the source for TryAPL for about 20 or 21 months now. And of course, it's running on the Diabot. So some of MiServer's features. HTTP is what's known as a sessionless protocol or a stateless protocol, which means that every transaction, every HTTP request from a browser is independent of any subsequent request. And so a lot of web server technologies implement some sort of state. They can do it by saving cookies on your PC. They can do it by maintaining some sort of a session space on the server. And MiServer does that by implementing sessions for every user that logs in. We save a cookie to uniquely identify the user, and then we associate an APL session with that cookie, and so you can maintain state across pages. Data binding, we've talked about that a fair bit today, and we don't have data binding that's quite as sophisticated yet as what we've seen with WPF, but hopefully we'll get there. But MiServer has had data binding from day one. Input elements on the web page can be bound to like-named fields that are in the page definition on the server. So in this case, laser time. So in this case, I've got some input forms here on my web page, and then I've got a number of fields in my page definition class that correspond to the names of those input fields. And so when the client, the browser, posts that data back to the server, MiServer knows to associate the values of those fields with the appropriate fields in the class. And MiServer 3 will extend this capability. You heard Chad, I think, talk a little bit about Knockout.js, and Morton had mentioned it. And it's a JavaScript library that implements data binding. And so that's something that we'll be looking at incorporating into MiServer 3. And then I also want to, unfortunately, the API documentation for the Syncfusion, sorry, Chad, I'm going to rag on you a little bit here, but didn't come out until about a week before the conference. And as such, I haven't had enough of a chance to look into it, but I want to look into the data binding capabilities of Syncfusion's JavaScript tools. MiServer supports a variety of JavaScript plugins. jQuery is a JavaScript library that a wide variety of tools are implemented using jQuery. Syncfusion uses jQuery, for one. And the nice thing that jQuery does is it eliminates the bumps that you encounter in trying to write applications that will go across browsers. So whether it's Google Chrome, Internet Explorer, Firefox, Opera, Apple Safari, it doesn't matter. jQuery smooths out the bumps for you for dealing with different browser platforms. And in addition to the jQuery base library, there are many, see, many squared, tools and tool sets based on jQuery. There's jQuery UI, which implements a number of widgets, interactions, effects, and themes. There's data tables, and I'll be showing you a little bit about that, and others. And then MiServer 3 will add jQuery mobile support and for mobile platforms, and also the SyncFusion collection of JavaScript tools. MiServer has supported SQAPL by using named data sources to make it easier. In one of my former lives, I did some Cold Fusion web development. And one of the things I liked about Cold Fusion was you could name a data source and then refer to it in your pages by that data source name. So you didn't have to go through the connecting, preparing the statement, executing it, and so on. So what we do is we have a configuration file that allows you to define data sources. And so here I've got a data source name of zip codes, and then it's a Microsoft Access database, and there's some information about how SQAPL can go about finding it. And so in my code, I can refer to it just by saying SQL do the data source name and then my SQL statement. So that cleans up that interaction, makes it a little bit easier. So, and of course, you can still use SQAPL natively in your web application. Logging. We have 3 different flavors of logging in MiServer. There's HTTP request logging. So every time a request for a resource comes in, we can turn on logging and make a record of it. And it will record the IP address of the requester. It will record the resource that was requested and some other statistics. And so this can be, the logs that are produced by this can be processed by any standard log processing tool. We also do error logging using Dr. A, which is Dyalog's error logging utility, which includes email notification when an error occurs. And then inside of MiServer itself, the core server, we have server and user configurable logging. So you can define different user events. So for instance, if you have some notion in your web application of a transaction, you could log every time a transaction occurs. Security features. We can provide secure communications using Conga. And if you were at the workshop on Sunday morning, we told you a little bit about that. We also support basic HTTP authentication. And the framework is extensible, so that if there were a need to implement digest, HTTP digest authentication, we could certainly do so. And we also support Windows integrated authentication, which implements single sign-on using that feature that's built into Conga. One of the things we're kind of excited about is the ability to run behind other web servers as a mapping handler. So you can run MiServer behind IIS or Apache. Now, what does this do for you? In a corporate environment, your corporate network administrator or IT manager may not be that thrilled about opening up a port to this thing called MiServer. However, they probably have ports, or they probably have running instances and trusted instances of IIS or Apache that are public facing. And so you can set up MiServer to run behind IIS or Apache. And it uses the CGI, the Common Gateway Interface, using a program called MiServer CGI. And MiServer runs in the background. MiServer is up and running, so it's not starting up a new instance of MiServer every time a request comes in. But MiServer CGI acts as a thin layer that forwards the request from IIS to MiServer and waits for the response to send back. MiServer generates XHTML, which is XML compliant HTML. So that means all attributes are quoted, all elements are closed. And why is this important? Well, the content then that's generated by MiServer pages can be processed by XML tools, which means that you can use Quad XML to build test and validation tools for your web pages. And if anybody's done any significant amount of web development, you'll know that testing web content can sometimes be a pain in the, well, you pick the part of anatomy that you care to. So here's an instance where I'm loading the definition of the index page. I'm creating a new instance of it and rendering it, which basically populates the content in the page. Then I render the content. And so I get some XHTML, which I can then pass to Quad XML to get an array form of my page data that I could then do stuff with. MiServer 3 builds page content by adding objects to the content object or to the content field of the page. And we'll go into some examples of this. But AJAX support is still supported via the AppleJax method, but we also allow you to name callback functions so that you can split up the processing for event handling. And I'll be showing demos of all of this at the end of the presentation. I'm terrible at switching between PowerPoint and APL, certainly not nearly as good as JD, and as such, I will avoid doing so, and I'll show you live code at the end. And MiServer 2 pages can still be built using MiServer 3, so you can mix the paradigms. And MiServer 3 is scheduled to be available second quarter next year. And one of the questions you may ask is, well, if we've already got MiServer 2 that can generate, decent web pages, why go to this object-oriented paradigm? And it's very simple, and there's really only one reason, because it gives you more control over how you manage your web content and how you build it. So I'm going to talk about the HTML element class. Every HTML5 element is implemented as an instance of the HTML element base class, and it's contained in the HTML namespace. So here I'm creating a new HTML division element. And so the constructor can accept content and a list of attributes. And render is then used to render the element's HTML. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that we said that we produce XHTML, and I said that all attributes are quoted, okay? Well, I didn't specify quotes around here, but the render function or method knows enough to put quotes around it to make it XHTML compliant. So it unfortunately, maybe it's good that it allows you to be sloppy. It doesn't encourage it, but if you are, we cope. Add adds to the HTML element's content. So I can add some text to my division. And setAdder sets element attributes. So I can set a little bit of JavaScript to the onClick attribute. This is something I wrestled with in the design of HTML element, because I was either going to go one way or the other, which is I was either going to implement all global attributes that you could have for an HTML element as assignable fields, in which case there are 108 of them. And I said, well, we really don't want to carry that baggage around with every instance of every element. And I said, and then the other way was to go, well, let's make them all available using the @her property. But so what we've done is we've selected 7 very common HTML element attributes that you can assign directly. And any other attributes you can assign via @her, which is the keyed property. So if you use @her, you can use it. How many people are familiar with keyed properties in Dyalog JD, I'd hope you would be. Okay, so not that many. Okay, read up on it because they're really cool. But you can basically manipulate attributes as a set of keyed properties. But you can also use the setAttr method, and any of these four formats is compatible. They all produce the same result. So again, we try and be really tolerant of and flexible in the way we accept input. In my work with jQuery, I found they have a technique called function chaining, which I thought was really cool. And so I've implemented it in the object model. So if add is passed an object, it returns a reference to the object that was added, and setAttr returns an object or a reference to its object. So that means I can create a new table element here, and then I can add a table row, a tr element, to that table. Now add passes a reference to the thing that I've added, so I'm now doing a setAttr on the table row, the tr element. So I'm setting it, giving it a class of HDG, and then I'm adding to the tr element a TB element, which is a table cell, and specifying the content of that. So again, it gives you kind of a powerful syntax for concisely specifying your HTML content. So let's look at some samples of my pages. So I will switch now. Okay, so I've got the MiServer workspace, or the MServer workspace loaded here, and I'm just going to start the font thing. Make it bigger. Is that what you're asking? Okay. Better? I mean, this is really all we're going to be doing in APL, so it's not that exciting, but okay. But what I've done, okay, let's go back here for just a second. So what it's done is it started up an instance of MiServer, and it's listening on port 8088. And so that means I can go to localhost :8088, that same port number, and get the MiServer 3 demos page. So here, we talked a little bit about the SQAPL integration before. So this is a page that implements I downloaded a database of all the United States zip codes and put it into Microsoft Access. So you can go here and select any state, and it selects the data, all the data for that state, and then renders it using a jQuery utility called data tables. And data tables does some kind of cool stuff. It's got built-in searching, so if I want to search for Deerfield, I can see that there are 3 zip codes here for Deerfield Beach. In addition, I can set the number of entries I want to display. I can go to previous and next pages, except my screen is being chopped off. So we will, that's better. Rats, there's always a glitch in a presentation, at least one, right? So you can scroll between pages, and you can sort by any column. So what does the code for this look like? Well, it's pretty complex. There it is. You may not be able to see that well, so I'll try and make it bigger. So this is, I hadn't converted this particular demo to MiServer 3 style yet, so this is concatenating those strings of HTML. But essentially, we initialize, when we first load the page, we load a list of all the states to populate that first combo box. And then when you select the combo box, we have a field here, state, that contains the state that you selected. We go ahead and execute a SQL query to pull out the zip codes for that state. And then we basically return the data we got to this object here called data table. So that's, where's data table? Right there. And so that's all that's necessary to get this functionality. And one of the things with any of our demo websites, anytime you want to see the source code that generates a page, you can click on the icon or the graphic in the upper left-hand corner to toggle between the web content and the source code. You know, they say, never let them see you sweat. And I got to tell you, in this heat and humidity, I'm doomed. So forgive me. So next, I want to talk a little bit about HTML5 support. HTML5 is cool. It's got a lot of power. I've only implemented, well, first of all of the HTML5 elements are implemented. I've only got a demo built for a couple of them. But in this case, when you want to, in years past, when you wanted to embed video on a web page, it was a pain. And so this is Colby Meets the Diabot. This is my dog. And when Morton came to Rochester a few weeks ago, I shot this from my phone, and Colby was really perplexed. Eventually, she gets really curious, and that's when I have to tell her no, and she backs off. So, again, what's the code to generate this look like? Well, it's pretty darn short. Yes, it's almost unreadably small. So, but you just add a video element to your page, give it a few attributes, you set a source attribute for where the video is, and that's it. And it just runs. And so and this is all done in the browser. The browser has the support for the HTML5 elements. Similarly, they have got HTML5 supports a number of different types of input classes. And so here's a color picker. That, again, there's no code here other than setting the type attribute on the input tag to color. And you get that. And there are, I don't know, 15 or so different input types: email, dates, months, all kinds of things, and it's pretty cool stuff. Next, I want to show you an interesting page that implements a lot of different pieces. This is going to have an HTML form here that takes some mortgage parameters, right? And we're going to do an outer product between a set of principals, interest rates, and terms. And then we're going to generate a tab for each principal. And on each tab, we'll give you the payment chart. And then we'll also include a Syncfusion graph showing you the payments. And one of the things I should have realized is that charting mortgage payments by interest rate and such really doesn't produce a very exciting graph, but you kind of get the idea, right? But again, these tabs here are the jQuery UI tabs control. The table is just it's just a table element that I generated, and then this chart down here is a Syncfusion chart control. You happy, Chad? All right. So, again, the amount of code to develop this, though, is really minuscule, at least in font. Basically, when you post back with the submit button, it's going to pull the values out. It's going to generate the series for each of the set of parameters that you gave it. It's going to then do two things. One is format the payments, which basically makes that table, and then it's going to make the chart, for each of the payment scenarios. And then I'm going to add a jQuery tabs control. And to each tab, I'm going to give it a title, which is the principal amount, and then the tab content is going to be the tables concatenated with the charts. And then I just have two subroutines to format the payments and to generate the charts. So you can get some pretty slick user interaction without a whole lot of code. This is another one that basically it's got more comments, I think, than code, but it puts on change handlers on each of the input fields, and as an input field changes, if the principal, interest rate, or term changes, it updates the payment. So if I want to borrow $1 million instead of 100,000, it tells me that. But you can also change the payment amount and say, okay, I can afford $2,500 a month, and so how much home can I afford for 30 years at 4.5% interest? And oh, I could get a $500,000 home. Cool. But again, the code to do that is, I've kind of, this is showing where we have a handler assigned, and I broke out this handler assignment into a number of discrete, where I was setting each attribute on a separate line, just for clarity and documentation purposes. But that could all be done on a single line. So if you want to write really compact, dense code, we're not disallowing that. Oh, you want to see the code? Oh, shucks. Okay, well, actually, it's a bit more code, but we're doing a number of things here. Let me. So I'm defining the board size. I'm giving it a 50 millisecond delay between iterations. I initialize the board pattern. And then this is, originally, I realized that I don't have to check for an initialized flag. I can just go ahead and, on the constructor for the page, initialize the board and be done with it, which is kind of neat. This basically builds the board content, and this JQ_on sets up a bunch of different handlers to handle the different events, including one of them should be triggering next-gen. And then Applejacks. Now see, this is where you get into those case statements. Because I've got multiple events coming through that I've got to handle, I've got to figure out which event is being signaled by what, and how am I going to handle it. And then I format the board. I've got some things to generate the next thing. And then this life script down here is just a bit of JavaScript that I wrote to implement the timer object to cycle through the generations. But I do want to give John his due. There's John's contribution to the effort. And well, quite frankly, this wouldn't have been possible without it, so I can't thank you enough. But okay, that's it for the thing. So, in the words of Porky the Pig, and now, please come to our Dyalog 2015 presentation called Reflections on Industrial Strength Applications. Well, thank you, and we'll see you at dinner, I guess.